The ideas expressed in the following presentations are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views of ACI or its committees. ACI web sessions are recorded at ACI conventions or other concrete industry events and will be made available for viewing free of charge for 1 week. Thereafter, they will be archived on the ACI website or added to ACI's online CEU program, depending on their content.
Good morning. I'm glad to be here, and I hope that y'all will find quite a bit of benefit out of our session. I was given the task of providing to you a background about the evolution of building codes, building and fire safety codes, and it's especially important when we start talking about the benefits of using concrete and masonry for construction, because they are so well suited to accomplishing that. So let me just make the comment. What I want to talk about is looking at the evolution of the codes and how they came about, primarily driven by fire. Look at how the model building codes have evolved over the last century plus in the United States. And then also look at some of the ramifications in that evolution that I think we're starting to see with regard to buildings being exposed to fire. So first of all, I want to start it by giving you definitions of conflagration. And in the dictionary.com, it says it's a destructive fire, usually very extensive. For Webster's, it says it's a large, disastrous fire. And then, of course, if you look at the Oxford English Dictionary, it'll say an extensive fire which destroys a great deal of land or property. And this definition or definitions of conflagration are important because they really are at the heart of what precipitated the use of building codes and start to provide building codes and regulations in communities in the United States. So, I have a question for you. If I said to you, what conflagration do you kind of know about or remember from history and comes to mind, what would be one of the fires that you might think about? Chicago. And sure enough, Chicago's the one that I decided I would start with and point out. Interestingly enough, you go read some of the history behind it. It started from a single source in O'Leary's barn. It doesn't say in the history that it really was the cow kicking over the lantern, although that's possible. But what's more important, though, is the incident as it happened occurred during a time when there were some high winds. There were a lot of flaming brands from the fire as it first started that began to be spread over a large area of Chicago. 17,000 buildings that were destroyed, many of them constructed of wood. And I'm not here to say that wood is bad materials, it's not, but it is unfortunate, it has that characteristic that it does burn. And so in fact that helped contribute to the spread of fire, and of course that fire, when it was completed, left over 100,000 people homeless. Well, there were other conflagrations that have occurred, some even before the Great Chicago Fire. One of them was in New York City in 1845. A whale and oil candle manufacturing facility. They actually had they used Spanish moss as part of their process, and some Spanish moss caught fire outside in the yard. And of course, flaming brands started to get spread by spread by wind. And as part of that, of course, they had a lot of buildings that were constructed of wood. And when the fire finished and was brought under control, 345 buildings destroyed, $5 to $10 million in property damage. And just so you'll know, that was the last of 3 major fires that the city of New York actually had. They had one in 1777 and also in 1835. One of the other ones was in Ottawa, Canada. Again, precipitated primarily by a building of wood catching on fire, a lot of closely spaced buildings, high wind. One of the other things that came into play then, and is probably true of these other fires that I just mentioned, was that the fire service sometimes didn't have the kind of equipment needed to fight these large fires. Water supplies in the city sometimes were not adequate either, so many of these things created some of the difficulty in trying to address them, but regardless, this particular fire spread and thousands of buildings were destroyed, and of course I've shown a picture at least of some of the aftermath. Many times when I think about these fires, I was putting together this presentation, I wanted to tell you, I kind of discovered this one, I didn't know that, but Jacksonville, Florida suffered a major conflagration in 1901. Same contributing factors, buildings of wood, high wind, In this case, 148 city blocks got destroyed, and over almost 2,400 buildings were destroyed in this process. And so the point I'm making is that the cities back at those times, it wasn't limited to like what we think the big cities, the New Yorks, or the Chicagos, or even the San Franciscos, although all of those have experienced it, but even some of the moderate-sized cities in other parts of the country. There was another fire in Canada that's worth mentioning is Toronto in 1904. That was their second major fire. Their first one was in 1849. This second fire, 20 acres destroyed, mostly the business district, which represents a significant amount of property investment. And in this case, they estimated $10 million in property damage. I should acknowledge to you these dollar amounts are dollars based on the time at which they had. They're not necessarily present-day dollars, which would be significantly higher. And then there was also in that same year a fire in Baltimore in 1904, 24 blocks of the business district. High winds contributed to it, buildings of wood construction. In this case, 1,500 buildings destroyed and an estimated $50 million in property damage. And I want to stop right here and mention the 1904 for Toronto and Baltimore was actually, in terms of conflagrations, were a tipping point for what really started precipitating building codes in the United States. It was precipitated really, let me say, earlier in 1866, and the insurance industries got together and formed a group called the National Board of Fire Underwriters. And as far as I'm concerned, I describe them like a trade association for the insurance industries. But their focus, because of these major fires that were occurring and the losses that they were experiencing, was to try to see if they could develop fire-safe criteria for communities, to see if they could in fact set up a grading system and rank cities on how well they have fire service and water supplies and things to protect the properties, and then to provide consistency, because they found they were all over the board on what kind of requirements they had and what things that they would underwrite. And so that combination of things is why they came together, but they really didn't undertake a set of rules or things until those two fires in 1904, Baltimore and Toronto. All of a sudden the losses were so huge, they said, whoa, we need to do something. And so lo and behold, they got together and through their technical committee, not unlike we see operating today, even within ACI, got together and developed a building code called the National Building Code. And in that building code, they started looking at the features from what had happened before and what should be required going forward. And of course that included things like in the very heavily urban areas, using more fire resistive construction, limit the amount of wood construction, pay attention to the municipal water supplies and what kind of water supplies are available to the community, pay attention to the fire service and whether they have adequate equipment in order to fight those fires, and even doing things like establishing fire districts. And I'll come back to fire districts in a minute. But I do want to say, I threw this one up there just because I happen to be from the South. For your benefit, I'm from Macon, Georgia, about 90 miles south of Atlanta. And I didn't even know this till I was doing the research on this, that even Atlanta experienced a conflagration in 1917. And in this case, they had the same characteristics, buildings of wood, large area, the 300 acres, 1,900 buildings destroyed, 10,000 people displaced, and about $5 million in damage. And of course, that's after the 1905 National Building Code was established, but I'm sure like anything, and we see today, when codes get set, sometimes the actual impacts of them don't show up till several years down the road. But what was occurring after the National Board of Fire Underwriters established this code was a lot of municipalities were adopting actually code documents. I happen to have in my possession two documents. They are from the city of Macon. I used to be a building official there. One of them is the 1914 building code. The other is the 1926. And in both cases, when I have looked at the provisions in those documents, they're not real big, but the provisions of those documents and compare them to the 1904, 1905 National Building Code, some of the provisions are very similar, usually encouraging fire-resistant construction and limiting wood in the heavy urban areas, which would include setting up fire districts. And of course, Macon at the time and when it first adopted those codes, it set itself up with fire districts where it actually limited the amount of combustibles in those areas because of the high property value, and also required in some cases some fire-resistant construction, and also started coming into play in limiting the size of the buildings based on the types of materials being used to build them. And of course, the whole purpose of that is to try to minimize damage to property should a fire event occur in a building. Well, as time went on, one of the things that happened was West Coast part of the country looked at the National Building Code by the insurance industry and really found that it didn't totally suit their needs. Some of the means and methods of construction in the western part of the country were different than what was in the Northeast, and I have to acknowledge most of what the National Building Code reflected was construction manners of the Northeast part of the country. And so they got together and they decided, let's put together our own code, and I call it a regional building code because they formed a group called the International Conference of Building Officials, made up of code officials from the major cities in the West Coast, western part of the country, and put together this document. And from that, in the early 1920s, we began to see that other parts of the country looked like they'd like to have their own codes too. The BOCA is the Building Officials and Code Administrators is the Northeast. The Standard Building Code for many years was the predominant code in the Southeast. Those were outgrowths of what took place in the western part of the country when ICBO developed their Uniform Building Code. And so if you look at BOCA, they were actually the first code official group that formed in 1915. They're the oldest model code group. They developed a code called the Basic Building Code in 1950. A lot of its basis followed the National Building Code that we saw developed in 1905. And in 1982, the insurance industry decided to get out of the building code business. And they, in fact, sold the rights to the National Building Code to BOCA. And when BOCA took over those rights, they changed their code from the Basic Building Code to the BOCA National Building Code. International Conference of Building Officials, I mentioned earlier, they formed in 1922, and of course their claim to fame is the fact they published the first regional model building code in 1927. Southern Building Code Congress International formed in the Southeast. They formed in 1941. They put together their first building code and published it in 1946. And in fact, the city of Macon, their first edition they adopted was the 1950 edition of the Southern Standard Building Code. Prior to that 1926 building code that I showed a copy of was what was in effect for all those years until 1950. And of course, they dropped the name Southern from the code in the 1973 and just became known as the Standard Building Code. So you had the Uniform Building Code, BOCA National Building Code, and the Standard Building Code. And of course, one of the other things that those three groups did to try to start maybe at a little bit more of a national basis was in the 1970s they formed a separate entity called the Council of American Building Officials for the purpose of developing a 1- and 2-family dwelling code to try to simplify and standardize construction of 1- and 2-family dwellings. And they also, in response to the energy crisis we had in this country, started developing the Model Energy Code, again with a standardized mechanism in mind. In the mid-1990s, the three groups got together and formed the International Code Council. Now, I want to tell you real quick, the reason they actually formed it was because on the western part of the country, ICBO was using plumbing code and mechanical codes developed by an organization called the International Association of Mechanical and Plumbing Officials, known as IAPMO. And IAPMO and ICBO kind of had a falling out. Before that, they kind of worked as a group and they had their set of codes to cover all features of building construction. But when they had this falling out, ICBO found itself with no mechanical or plumbing code. And so they approached BOCA and said, you know, we'd like to see if we could form a partnership and start using your plumbing and mechanical code. And that precipitated discussions to say, well, maybe we should get together and try to form an organization and develop a single set of codes. And then they asked SBCCI if they wanted to join in. They said yes, and that's what created the coalition to start forming the International Code Council, and their goal was to develop a single set of construction codes for building, fire, plumbing, mechanical, gas, zoning, and energy as a single unit. And that's what started taking place in the mid-1990s and eventually resulted in the first code being published in 2000. One of the things they had to do, though, as part of that was if they were going to do a single set of codes, the three groups agreed to stop publishing their model codes. So sometimes if you hear somebody refer to a Uniform Building Code or a BOCA code, all of those documents got stopped being published as late as 1999, and those are the last editions you'll ever see. From that, the two groups got together, and they also stopped publishing the CABO codes and instead changed the name of them, is really the essence of it, changed the name of them and let them become the I codes for 1 and 2 family dwellings and for the energy code. And then, of course, one of the other things the three groups did, they were actually three separate entities. They finally reached agreement that they would dissolve their organizations and turn everything over to the International Code Council, which is a single entity many of us are familiar with today. That action took place at their business meeting in Fort Worth, Texas in 2002. And of course, the end result now is we have a single set of model codes. Model codes we generally use in the country. The two predominant ones relating to fire are the International Building Code and the International Fire Code. But one of the things I want to comment on is the fact that in this process, one of the unfortunate things is during the development of the codes, and I used to be with the Portland Cement Association, I participated in all of that process in developing those. When it came to requirements, usually the structural area, they were always using whatever was the most stringent requirements. For example, if it came to seismic provisions, the West Coast was well known for what their seismic provisions were in the Uniform Building Code. And so they had much more of an influence on what went into the International Building Code. When it came to fire safety, however, they didn't take that same philosophy. They generally said, let's choose the least common denominator. And so they would look at the three codes, and the essence of it was we want to have a code that doesn't make some jurisdictions have buildings that are non-compliant because lo and behold, they may have less fire resistance. So they took the least common denominator, and the unfortunate part of that is as we progressed along, we generally have begun to see the influences of this, including code changes that happened since then. So now all of a sudden we find ourselves building extremely large, light wood frame buildings. And again, I want to say that there's nothing wrong with light wood frame buildings, but there is a propensity for them to burn, unfortunately. In this case, this is a 5-story building, and you can see it has quite significant size. And I will say, I'm not expecting you to read all those, but I put those up there as examples. We're seeing time and again as these buildings have started becoming built, some of them burned while under construction because they weren't all completed, but still they represent, in my mind, what I always do when I do presentations is they represent a significantly large bonfire. I don't know any way else to describe it. And we continue to see incidences time and again that are happening with these buildings in terms of burning, as well as we get a loss of, not so much a loss of life, we've not had that fortunately, but we require a lot of fire service attention in order to keep them under control and keep them from spreading. And we also require, it ends up resulting in a lot of property damage. And of course, many times the ones I just showed you, 3 of the 4 were under construction, but I want to acknowledge that we're starting to see incidences of buildings burning that are occupied. In this case, this is an apartment fire in Edgewater, New Jersey. Now, in fact, I'll stop here and ask, does that kind of give you a sense of what the definition of conflagration is? It does to me. And so when I look at this and I realize, gosh, that is significant. The building itself was primarily of wood construction, 230 units destroyed. These were occupied units, over 1,000 people that were displaced by this event. I don't have the property damage figures, but they were significant. I have talked to the fire chief that fought that fire, and he told me they had to depend on calling on fire departments in nearby communities to come in and help them because it clearly was overwhelming what they were capable of handling. Fortunately, no loss of life, I want to say. And then I begin to say to myself, well, is history repeating itself? Well, just the other week or so ago in Raleigh, North Carolina, a building under construction. Again, a large wood frame building. I have visited the site, and I want to tell you, I talked to the contractor. The building was completed in terms of the envelope enclosed. They were just starting to put the sheetrock in place. When the fire occurred, the fire service responded and fortunately did a good job of at least minimizing the impact. But I want to acknowledge to you, this building, this project reflects the fact that we're not talking just the loss of that building. We're also talking the loss or damage to surrounding buildings. That's a 12-story condominium building right there that is completely shut down right now, suffered damage to the units as they face the building which is under fire, which used to be right here. This is a condominium or an apartment building right here. The whole face of this suffered damage. A few of the apartments suffered damage. The fortunate part was the fire service was set up along here to protect the exposure. Otherwise, I'm sure if it had got into that building, which I suspect is wood frame, you'd have had this same incident happening like what we saw back in the 1900s. Fire spread from property to property to property. And then I know there's at least three other buildings. These two and this building right here, all three suffered damage. The businesses were shut down because of this fire event. So it begins to raise the question, are we seeing the same problem that we first saw why building codes were developed? And I have a feeling or suggestion I think we are.
Thank you, Steve.